Ingrid Bergman was never a typical Hollywood star. She didn't rely on glamour, scandal, or carefully crafted personas to maintain her image. Instead, Ingrid Bergman built her legacy on honesty, both in her performances and in her life. From her unforgettable role in Casablanca to her powerful presence in Notorious, she brought a kind of emotional truth to the screen that few could match. But behind that grace and authenticity was a woman with strong opinions. Ingrid Bergman believed deeply in the craft of acting. She valued sincerity, discipline, and emotional realism. And when she encountered actors who didn't share those values, whether because of ego, carelessness, or completely different approaches, it created tension. Over the course of her long career, Bergman worked with some of the greatest names in cinema. But not all of those collaborations were smooth. In fact, there were certain actors whose styles and personalities clashed so strongly with hers that she struggled to connect with them at all. These weren't just minor disagreements. There were moments where artistic philosophies collided. One of the most well-known tensions in Bergman's career involved Humphrey Bogart during the filming of Casablanca. While their on-screen chemistry became legendary, the reality behind the scenes was far more complicated. Bogart was known for his dry, often distant demeanor, and he approached his work with a kind of controlled detachment. Bergman, on the other hand, relied heavily on emotional connection. She needed to feel the scene, to understand it from within. This difference created a subtle disconnect. At times, Bergman reportedly found Bogart difficult to read, almost inaccessible emotionally. He delivered his lines perfectly, but there was a barrier she couldn't quite break through. For an actress who thrived on connection, that distance was frustrating. What made this even more challenging was the uncertainty surrounding the script. During filming, Bergman didn't even know which character her role would ultimately end up with, and she relied heavily on emotional cues from her co-stars to guide her performance. Bogart's reserved nature made that process harder. While he remained professional, he didn't offer the kind of collaborative energy Bergman was used to. This forced her to adapt, to find emotional grounding within herself rather than through interaction. In many ways, it pushed her to become even stronger as an actress, but it also highlighted the gap between their approaches. It wasn't dislike in a personal sense, but it was a clear mismatch in how they experienced the scene. Another actor who didn't quite align with Bergman's style was Gary Cooper. Cooper was admired for his natural, understated performances, but that same simplicity sometimes felt limiting to Bergman. She was an actress who explored layers, who searched for complexity in every moment. Cooper, by contrast, often relied on instinct and minimalism. While this worked beautifully for his own performances, it sometimes left Bergman feeling as though there was something missing in their scenes together. She appreciated his professionalism, but she struggled to find the same level of emotional engagement. Cooper's style was rooted in stillness, in saying more with less. But for Bergman, that restraint could feel like distance rather than depth. She often preferred actors who responded actively, who brought a sense of movement and emotional evolution into a scene. With Cooper, the energy sometimes felt static, as if the scene remained in one emotional space rather than developing. This created a subtle tension, not visible to the audience, but very real for Bergman. She had to adjust her own performance, filling in emotional gaps that she felt weren't being explored. It was another example of how two talented actors can create something beautiful on screen while still feeling disconnected behind the scenes. Then there was Charles Boyer, whose highly polished and theatrical style stood in contrast to Bergman's naturalism. Boyer came from a more classical acting tradition, where performance was often more controlled and deliberate. Bergman, however, was moving toward a more modern approach, one that prioritized spontaneity and emotional truth. This difference created friction. She sometimes felt that Boyer's performances were too calculated, too rehearsed. For her, acting was about discovery in the moment, not perfection. Working with Boyer required Bergman to navigate a different rhythm entirely. His precision meant that scenes were often carefully structured, leaving little room for improvisation or emotional shifts. While some actors thrived in that environment, Bergman found it restrictive. She believed that real emotion couldn't always be planned, it had to be experienced. This difference didn't lead to open conflict, but it created an internal frustration. She respected Boyer's talent, but she couldn't fully connect with his method. It was a clash between tradition and evolution, between control and freedom. A more intense dynamic existed with Yul Brynner. Brynner was known for his commanding presence and strong personality, both on and off screen. He carried himself with confidence, sometimes bordering on dominance. Bergman, who valued collaboration, found this difficult. Acting for her was about balance, about giving and receiving equally within a scene. With Brynner, that balance could feel disrupted. His intensity sometimes overshadowed the shared space that Bergman believed was essential. Brynner's approach often centered on control. He knew exactly how he wanted to appear on screen, and he worked to maintain that image consistently. While this created powerful performances, it also limited the flexibility of the scene. Bergman felt that true acting required vulnerability, a willingness to lose control and respond naturally. With Brynner, that vulnerability was harder to access. The dynamic became less about interaction and more about coexistence within the same frame. It was effective visually, but emotionally, it felt less connected. Finally, there was Spencer Tracy, a legend in his own right. Tracy was known for his realism and grounded performances, qualities that aligned closely with Bergman's values. However, their differences emerged in a more subtle way. Tracy had a deeply internal process, often keeping his thoughts and emotions to himself. Bergman, while also introspective, preferred a more open exchange during rehearsals. She believed that discussing a scene could deepen the performance. Tracy, however, relied more on instinct and personal interpretation. This difference created a quiet tension. It wasn't about disagreement, but about communication. Bergman sometimes felt that she was working alongside Tracy rather than with him. He would deliver powerful performances, but without the collaborative dialogue she valued. This made it harder for her to fully engage in the process. Yet, at the same time, she respected his talent immensely. It was one of those rare situations where admiration and frustration existed side by side. When you look at the actors Ingrid Bergman struggled to connect with, a pattern becomes clear. It wasn't about ego or personal dislike. It was about philosophy. Bergman believed in emotional truth, in connection, and in the idea that acting should feel alive in every moment. When she encountered actors who approached the craft differently, whether through control, distance, or tradition, it created friction.